Imagine being forced into a marriage at the age of 13, not to a stranger, but to your own grandfather. This isn't some story lost to time, nor a distant world. It happened in the remote Appalachian Mountains. Here, families were isolated from society, and deep within the heart of this isolation, a dark history began to unfold. A young boy was condemned to a life that no one should ever endure, a life twisted by generations of bloodlines folding in on themselves. But this is more than a twisted tale of fate. It's a glimpse into how secrecy, isolation, and the choices of a few can destroy an entire bloodline. It's about the terrible consequences when families close themselves off from the world, where control is handed down through power, not love. It's the haunting story of a boy whose life was already decided before he was born. A life written in silence, twisted by his grandfather's control, and bound by the devastating consequences of generational inbreeding. Stay with me as we dive into this chilling story that was never meant to be told, a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, power, and the human cost of secrecy. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you want to hear more shocking stories from history, stories that you won't find in any textbook. Your support helps bring these hidden truths to light. In the remote Appalachian Mountains, where the mist clings to the trees like a secret, families lived in isolation so deep that their bloodlines became prisons of their own making. The world outside barely touched them, and they seldom ventured beyond the mountain ridges. The men of this family carried the weight of generations upon their shoulders, with secrets buried deep in the soil they worked. Life in the hollers of Appalachia was harsh, but it wasn't the rugged terrain that shaped these men. It was their isolation. Cut off from the outside world, they created their own reality, their own laws, where blood was thicker than anything else. Their loyalty wasn't to community or society, it was to survival, to keeping their bloodline pure, no matter the cost. In this forgotten corner of the world, one boy's life was already determined before he even had a chance to take his first breath. Born into a family that had long been defined by silence and secrecy, he inherited a fate that no one should ever endure. His grandfather, an older man, was the pillar of the family, and as the generations folded in on each other, their roles became distorted. The boy's grandfather wasn't just a family figure. He was the master of their isolated world. His decisions governed the lives of everyone around him, including his grandson. Control was his currency, and love was an afterthought. In a world with no outsiders, he shaped their destinies without ever questioning his authority. The boy never knew freedom. His life was a constant loop, a series of events set in motion long before he was born. The isolation of the mountains ensured there were no questions, no interruptions. The family kept to itself, and what happened within its walls stayed there. Silence was the shield that protected them, but it also became their cage. As the years passed, the boy grew up surrounded by men who never questioned their own actions, because there was nothing in the outside world to challenge them. They were the law, the community, and the family. His grandfather ruled with an iron fist, and his power was absolute. But the boy's existence was something far darker, hidden beneath the surface of what should have been a nurturing environment. It wasn't just that the boy was confined to the family's isolated existence. It was that the roles within the family were so twisted that they no longer made sense. The concept of father, son, brother, or grandfather had lost its meaning. Blood was the only thing that mattered, and it became the glue that held them together, no matter how malformed or fractured it was. The boy's fate was sealed when his grandfather decided that he would marry him. It was a decision made not out of love, but of necessity, a way to continue the family name, no matter how broken or deformed it became. This was not about affection, but about control. The family's survival depended on maintaining the bloodline at all costs. No one in the family seemed to bat an eye. The men accepted the decision as though it was the only natural thing in the world. No one spoke of the horrors it carried with it. In a place where silence was golden, any form of rebellion was unthinkable. The boy, too young to fully understand the implications of what was happening, was thrust into a life he could not escape. The men of this family believed that power came from maintaining control. They didn't see the damage they were doing to their bloodline, to their legacy, because they didn't want to. To them, tradition was the ultimate authority, and their version of tradition demanded the purity of bloodlines. That meant no outside influence, no new blood, only what was already there, even if it was sick and twisted. As the boy grew, the weight of his family's history pressed down on him, its scars already visible in the deformities that marred his body. His face, distorted by the effects of generations of inbreeding, became a reflection of the family's decline. His eyes were set too close, his jaw never fully formed. But in a world where blood and silence reigned, no one dared to speak of it. The boy, once full of hope and innocence, became a mere reflection of the tragedy that was unfolding around him. His grandfather's influence over him was absolute, shaping his future with an iron grip. But this wasn't love. It was a twisted inheritance that had been passed down through generations, a cruel legacy written in blood and silence. This family's collapse was not sudden. It was slow, creeping, and inevitable. The boy's deformities weren't just physical. They were a sign of a much larger rot, one that had been festering for generations. As his body grew, so did the consequences of his family's refusal to break free from their cycle of silence and isolation. And yet, even as the boy's body failed him, his family remained blind to the horrors they had created. The men never asked themselves why their bloodline had become so tainted, why their children were born sickly, deformed. To them, the family name, no matter how twisted it became, was sacred. And in this warped world, that name was all that mattered. No one dared question the grandfather's authority, not even as the boy's fate became clear. His life was shaped by the generations before him, by the decisions made long before he could voice his opinion. He was a prisoner in a family that had long abandoned the concept of love in favor of blood, power, and silence. This was his inheritance. This was his legacy. And so, as the boy's life unfolded, it became a tragic reminder of what can happen when secrecy and isolation are allowed to fester unchecked. In the Appalachian Mountains, hidden from the world, an entire bloodline collapsed under the weight of its own darkness. The boy was born into this cycle, and his life, like those before him, was doomed before it ever had a chance to start. In the isolated mountains, the grandfather held unchallenged power, not just as a patriarch, but as a ruler. His authority defined everything, dictating the lives of his sons and grandsons with an iron fist. The family's survival was bound to his decisions. His word was law. The grandfather's decisions were seen as divine within the family. No one questioned him. His grip on the family was absolute, his rule enforced through fear and the total absence of outside influence. He was their protector, their guide, their king. In his mind, love was irrelevant. Control, lineage, and power were all that mattered. The boy, his grandson, was to serve as the continuation of his name, his legacy. The family tree would never split. It would only continue, folding in on itself again and again. The grandfather's influence extended beyond normal family bounds. It wasn't about affection. It was about survival. He believed that keeping the bloodline pure was the key to maintaining the family's strength, no matter the consequences. He never considered the damage. He never looked at his grandson and saw a human being. He saw an extension of himself. The boy was just another vessel to carry his name forward, no matter the toll it would take. To the grandfather, the concept of love and family as outsiders knew it didn't apply. The family was more of a blood cult than a community. Every decision was made to preserve the purity of their bloodline, even at the cost of the individual. In his mind, the boy's fate was already sealed. From the moment of his birth, He was marked to continue the twisted family legacy, a legacy that had no room for outsiders or anything that could dilute their blood. The grandfather's world was one where the roles of father, son, brother, and grandfather no longer made sense. Power wasn't derived from age, wisdom, or kindness. It was derived from blood, lineage, and domination. It was a twisted form of control. The boy, though young, could feel the weight of his grandfather's gaze. His grandfather's plans for him were already set. The boy's life wasn't his own. It was an inheritance, something passed down from one generation to the next, regardless of his desires. This control was a silent force. It didn't need to be spoken. The family had long ago learned to obey without question. The grandfather had trained them all, teaching them that submission was necessary for survival in the harsh mountains. The boy was isolated in his own world. His grandfather's decisions were unopposed, and the boy's only role was to accept whatever was placed before him. There was no room for rebellion, no space for doubt. His life was not his own. It belonged to his grandfather. The grandfather didn't just rule with authority. He ruled with fear. The family knew what happened to those who tried to break free. They had seen it happen to others, had heard the whispers about the consequences of disobedience. No one dared to challenge the grandfather. It wasn't just physical force that kept them in line. It was the power of isolation. The family was so far removed from the world that even the concept of freedom seemed alien. The grandfather ensured that there was no escape. To leave was unthinkable. This isolation allowed the grandfather's power to flourish. In a world without outside interference, his control went unquestioned. And as the boy grew, his role in the family's future was more clearly defined. He was to be an extension of his grandfather's will. The boy never had the chance to experience a normal childhood. His grandfather's plans left no room for innocence, no room for growth outside of the family's rigid structure. The boy's future was set in stone, and it was not one of his choosing. The grandfather's dominance went beyond the family home. In the rare moments when they did interact with outsiders, the grandfather ensured that his influence over the boy was visible. The family was a reflection of his power, and the boy was its living embodiment. The grandfather's control was all-encompassing. He didn't just own the family's name, he owned their lives. Every decision made was done with the intent of maintaining the family's bloodline, ensuring it stayed pure and free from outside influence. This control, which the grandfather wielded so effectively, was not seen as tyrannical by those within the family. It was simply the way of life. To question it was to question everything they knew, and in such an environment, questioning was impossible. As the boy grew, the weight of his grandfather's expectations became heavier. The future that was being built for him was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. His life and the lives of his sons would follow the same twisted path. The mountains echoed with silence, a silence so profound it became oppressive. The family, secluded in its own world, never spoke of the twisted legacy they were creating. Silence was their shield, but it was also their prison. There were no outsiders to challenge their way of life, no voices raised in protest. The family's isolation allowed their secrets to grow, and with each passing generation, the silence deepened. It was as if the world outside had forgotten them. But within the family, silence wasn't just a tool of protection. It was a weapon. It was used to bury the truths no one wanted to face. The grandfather ruled not only through control, but through this silence. As the boy grew, he became more aware of this silence. It wasn't just the quiet of the mountains, it was the quiet that followed them everywhere. It was the silence of unspoken rules, of buried shame, and of secrets no one dared acknowledge. The men of the family had long learned that silence was survival. They understood that to speak too loudly was to draw attention, and in a world where attention meant danger, silence was the only safe option. The outside world was something to be feared, and silence kept them hidden. The family's silence became a language of its own. In every glance, in every quiet moment, there was meaning. But it was a language that could not be understood by outsiders. To the boy, it was the only language he knew. This silence wasn't born of peace. It was born from the fear of what would happen if their secrets were exposed. In the mountains, where survival meant isolation, the boy was taught that to speak was to invite destruction. The silence made it easy for the grandfather to maintain control. It allowed him to make decisions without challenge, to impose his will on the family without question. It was a tool, and it was one that kept the boy bound to his fate. But as the boy grew older, he began to sense the suffocating weight of that silence. He began to understand that the walls around him weren't just physical, they were mental. They were built of fear, of guilt, and of the knowledge that escape was impossible. The men around him never spoke of the horrors they were living. They never acknowledged the deformities, the suffering, or the twisted cycles that had been perpetuated for generations. It was all ignored, buried beneath the heavy mantle of silence. In this world, the boy was trapped in a cycle that was generations deep. His grandfather's control, coupled with the family's silence, ensured that he would never break free. It was a suffocating existence, but it was all he knew. The boy longed for freedom, but he didn't even know what that freedom looked like. In a world so isolated, the concept of escape seemed like a fantasy, a dream that could never become real. The silence had grown so deep that it had become part of him. As the family continued to shrink into its own world, the boy found himself becoming more and more like those around him. The deformities, the silence, the lack of choice, all of it began to shape him in ways he couldn't understand. But deep inside, he knew something was wrong. He didn't know how to name it, but he felt it every day. There was a growing awareness within him, a realization that he was trapped in something bigger than himself, a cycle that could never be broken. The silence around him was all-encompassing, and yet it was also isolating. In a family so deeply entrenched in its own secrets, the boy had no one to turn to, no one who would help him escape from the life that had been forced upon him. The outside world was a distant concept, one that he had never truly experienced. But even so, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to life than the quiet, suffocating existence he had been born into. But that world was unreachable. The boy, bound by silence and his grandfather's control, was forced to accept his place in the family. His future was already decided for him, and in the silence of the mountains, there was no room for rebellion, no room for hope, only silence, and the legacy of generations that had long since lost their way. The truth of the boy's existence was one that no one dared speak aloud. The family, lost in their isolation, had built a reality where the twisted, dark secrets were never acknowledged. The grandfather ruled with an iron will. As the boy matured, he began to feel the weight of the family's unspoken truth. He didn't fully understand it, but he could feel the shame that seemed to hang in the air, suffocating everyone. It was never discussed. Every man in the family knew the truth, but none of them spoke of it. It was too dangerous, too unsettling. So they ignored it. Silence became the only response. The truth was buried beneath layers of fear. The grandfather had worked hard to create this world, one where the truth didn't matter as long as the bloodline remained pure. His authority over the family ensured that no one ever dared question him, or the past that had led them here. To the boy, this silence was normal. He couldn't imagine any other way of life. The truth of his family, of his bloodline, was something that existed only in the shadows, never to be brought into the light. But as time passed, the boy began to sense that something was wrong. The family's legacy, as twisted as it was, didn't feel right. He saw the deformities, the sickness that ran through the generations, and began to wonder if it was the price of silence. The men, like the boy's grandfather, had lived this way for so long that it was all they knew. They didn't question their actions. To do so would mean confronting the shame that had been passed down to them, a shame they could never escape. In their minds, this was simply the way things were. The boy, born into this world, was destined to continue the cycle. He was a part of the family's legacy, a legacy of silence, of blood, and of an unbroken line that ran deep into the mountains. The truth, however, was more than just silence. It was the cost of inbreeding, the physical and mental toll it took on the family. The deformities, the sickness, the shortened lives, all of it was the price they paid for their refusal to let in new blood. The boy didn't understand all of it, but he felt the consequences. His body, already deformed by the legacy of his family, bore the marks of a history he had no power to change. His grandfather had ensured that the family's bloodline would never die. The outside world never seemed real to him. His family had created a world where there was no room for the truth, no room for change. Everything was designed to keep the bloodline pure, even if that purity came at the cost of the family's sanity and health. For the boy, the truth of his existence was something he could never escape. It was a weight that pressed down on him, day after day, a reminder of what his grandfather had done, and what the family had allowed to happen for generations. The boy's life had been written before he even took his first breath. He didn't have the luxury of choice. He didn't have the ability to challenge the truth of his existence because no one around him was willing to do so. Silence ruled. As he grew older, the boy became more aware of his place in this dark, twisted cycle. He saw the way his family members, his uncles and cousins, were marked by the same deformities, the same sickness. It was a pattern he couldn't deny. But no one spoke of it. No one acknowledged the truth. It was too painful, too overwhelming. So they continued, generation after generation, passing down the same secrets, the same deformities, without ever questioning the cost. In this family, silence wasn't just the absence of words. It was the refusal to see the truth. It was the refusal to confront the darkness that had festered for so long. And the boy, trapped within this world, could do nothing but accept it. The family had learned to live with the truth, or rather, to ignore it. But the boy, though he hadn't fully understood it yet, could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. It was only a matter of time before he, too, would bear the full consequences. But for now, the boy remained caught in the family's silence. His life, like those before him, was shaped by the unspoken truth, and as the grandfather's control over him tightened, there seemed to be no way out. As the boy grew older, the weight of his family's legacy became undeniable. The deformities, the mental strains, and the twisted cycles that defined their bloodline were impossible to ignore. His body showed the signs of their collapse. The deformities were visible in every man of the family. Eyes too close, jaws misshapen, limbs bent in unnatural ways. These were the marks of a bloodline that had folded in on itself so many times that it could no longer function properly. The boy, now becoming a man, could feel his body slowly failing him. The deformities that had always been part of his family's legacy were becoming part of his own story. He could feel the genetic damage deep within him. His grandfather's legacy, once a source of power, was now a curse. The family's purity, which had been so fiercely protected, had led to this, an irreversible collapse. The boy's future was now written in the scars of his lineage. He wasn't the only one to suffer. His uncles, cousins, and brothers bore the same marks of inbreeding. The damage was generational, and it was only growing worse with each passing year. The family had become a shadow of what it once was. The boy's body, once full of promise, was now a testament to the failure of the bloodline. His deformities were more pronounced, and his mind, too, began to show signs of the mental collapse that had plagued his family for generations. The boy tried to hold on to the idea that he could somehow escape this fate, But there was no escape. The family's curse had been passed down to him, just as it had been passed down to those before him. There was no way out. The grandfather's grip on the family remained firm, but his control was no longer enough to stop the inevitable. The bloodline was collapsing from within, and the boy could see it happening. There was no way to stop the rot. As the boy grew into adulthood, the weight of his family's history pressed down on him harder. He saw the deformities in his own reflection and realized that there was no escaping the cycle. He was doomed to repeat the mistakes of his ancestors. Every attempt to break free was met with resistance. The family had long since accepted its fate. They were too deep in their isolation to see the damage they were doing. To them, the bloodline was sacred, even as it crumbled. The boy's life became a constant reminder of the family's downfall. His grandfather's control, once absolute, now seemed like a last desperate attempt to hold together something that was already falling apart. The family was beyond saving. The boy's existence was now a tragedy. He had no future outside of the family, no other option, no way to escape the path that had been laid out for him from the moment of his birth. His life was a reflection of his bloodline's destruction. The family's collapse wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, mental, and emotional. The boy's own sense of self began to deteriorate as he realized the depth of the damage. He was part of a legacy that could never be healed. As the boy moved through life, he became a living testament to the dangers of isolation. His family's refusal to allow new blood in had led them to this point, each generation more broken than the last. And now, it was his turn. There was no joy in the boy's life, no hope for the future. Every day he saw the damage that had been done to him, to his family, to everything he had once hoped for. The bloodline was collapsing, and nothing could save it now. The family had become a shadow of itself. Once strong, now weak. Once proud, now broken. The boy, trapped within this collapsing world, could only watch as everything around him fell apart. The legacy he was born into was doomed to die. But despite all of this, the boy remained tied to the family's history. He was the product of generations of isolation, and as much as he wanted to escape, he couldn't. The collapse of the bloodline was inevitable, and he was part of it. In the end, the family's isolation had sealed its fate. What had once been a place of power had become a prison of broken lives. The boy's life was just another example of what happens when blood is kept too pure, when the family closes itself off. The boy's life, once full of potential, had become a tragedy. As he grew older, his physical and mental deterioration mirrored the collapse of his family. The marks of inbreeding were now visible in him. The deformities that had once been an abstraction were now part of the boy's everyday life. His body was warped by the same bloodline that had carried him to this point, and there was no escaping it. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of the damage. His grandfather's legacy had passed down not just a name, but a curse. The boy was trapped within this cycle, unable to break free, his body a constant reminder of his fate. The boy's mind, too, began to show the effects of his family's twisted legacy. The mental degradation was just as unavoidable as the physical. The boy had inherited not just deformities, but the weight of generations of mistakes. But even as his body and mind began to deteriorate, the grandfather remained a constant force in his life. The boy was still bound to him, still under his control. There was no escape, not from the family, not from the past. The boy's relationships with other men in the family had become strained. They too were trapped in the same cycle. None of them could break free from the legacy that had been passed down to them, and the boy felt more isolated than ever. The grandfather, in his old age, still believed in the purity of the family's bloodline. He saw the boy not as a human being, but as an extension of himself, a vessel for the family's name to live on, no matter the cost. But the boy knew that this was not a life worth living. He had inherited the deformities, the sickness, the insanity that had been passed down through generations. He could feel his body failing, his mind unraveling, and there was nothing he could do. The tragedy of the boy's life was not just in the physical deformities or the mental strain. It was in the fact that he had never had a chance to live a life of his own. His destiny was sealed before birth. The boy's existence had always been defined by his grandfather's control. He was nothing more than a pawn in a twisted game that spanned generations. His life was never his own. It was always part of a greater scheme. But as he grew older, the boy began to realize the depth of his tragedy. He was trapped in a world of inbreeding, isolation, and silence. There was no hope for him, no escape from the family's legacy. The boy, once full of potential, now lived in constant pain, both physical and emotional. His deformities, once subtle, had now become unmistakable. His body and mind were failing, and yet there was no one who could help him. His grandfather, in his old age, continued to enforce the family's twisted tradition. The boy, now a young man, was still bound to him, still forced to carry on the legacy of a bloodline that was collapsing under its own weight. The boy's life had become a mirror of his family's decline. What had once been a powerful bloodline was now a dying relic of the past. The boy was its last remaining hope, but he was nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. Despite the growing recognition of his own destruction, the boy still felt bound to the family. The silence, the isolation, the deformities, they were all he knew. And in a world so isolated, he couldn't imagine a life beyond it. As the boy reached adulthood, his physical and mental condition worsened. The legacy of his family had become a prison, and there was no way to escape. He could feel his body deteriorating with each passing day, and his mind was starting to unravel. There was no future for the boy, no hope for redemption. He was trapped in a cycle that had been set in motion long before he was born, a cycle that had already destroyed the lives of his ancestors. Now, it was his turn. As the boy entered adulthood, the weight of his family's legacy became almost unbearable. His deformities, both physical and mental, had progressed, and his once promising future had been swallowed by the tragedy of his bloodline. The boy's life had been shaped by isolation, but now, as he aged, he began to see the true extent of the damage that had been done. His body had grown weaker, his mind more fragmented, and there was no one to help. The family's grip on him remained tight. Even as he grew older, his grandfather's control over him didn't waver. The boy's existence was still defined by the family's twisted legacy, and he had no way to escape it. Years passed, but the boy remained trapped. His deformities worsened, his body bending under the strain of generations of inbreeding. The toll it had taken on his body was evident in every movement, every breath he took. The family's silence, once a shield, had become a suffocating force. The boy was too broken to ever break free, too entrenched in the family's world to imagine a life outside of it. His entire existence had been dictated by them. No one in the family ever spoke of what was happening. They continued the cycle of silence, passing down their twisted legacy to the next generation without ever questioning it. The boy could see the end of the line coming, but he was powerless to stop it. The boy's body began to fail him completely. His joints twisted, his limbs weakened, and his vision blurred. But even in his weakened state, his grandfather's control over him never wavered. The family's legacy had claimed him fully. The boy, now a man in the twilight of his life, understood that his time was running out. There was no escape from the family's grip, no way to undo the damage that had been done to him. His life had been one long, unbroken chain. There was no love in his life, no connection to the world outside. The boy had become a mere shadow of the man he could have been, lost to a cycle of inbreeding and silence that had consumed every part of his existence. As the years dragged on, the boy grew more frail, more broken. His body, which had once held the promise of youth, was now a testament to the family's collapse. Every step was a reminder of the curse he could not escape. The boy's final years were spent in quiet despair. He had no family outside of the bloodline that had destroyed him. The isolation he had known his entire life had only deepened, and now it seemed as though there would be no end to his suffering. As his body continued to decay, the boy realized that he had never truly lived. His existence had been consumed by the family's need to preserve their bloodline, by the silence that had surrounded him since birth. There was no escaping it now. In his final moments, the boy could do nothing but reflect on the life that had been stolen from him. His grandfather's legacy, once so powerful, had led to his undoing. There would be no redemption, no salvation, only the slow, inevitable end. The family had always been the center of his world. And now, as he lay on his deathbed, he realized that it was the family that had consumed him. The cycle had finally come to an end, but it had left him broken and lost. The boy, now a man, died without ever knowing what it was like to be free. He never had the chance to live outside the shadow of his grandfather's control, to escape the suffocating silence of the mountains. His life was a tragedy. In the end, the boy's death was just another chapter in the family's long history of decay. He had been the last of a bloodline that had grown so twisted, so broken, that it could no longer survive. The family's curse had claimed him. The mountains, once a place of isolation and survival, had become a symbol of the family's downfall. What had been a refuge for the men who lived there had turned into a prison that consumed everything it touched. The boy's family, which had once lived in complete isolation, had grown so deeply entrenched in its own secrets that nothing could break through. The legacy of silence and inbreeding had become their curse, their inheritance. For generations, the family had closed itself off from the outside world, believing that isolation was the only way to protect what remained of their bloodline. But in the end, that isolation had destroyed them. The final chapter of this family's legacy was one of tragedy. The boy's life, marked by deformities and mental degradation, was the inevitable result of a history that had refused to embrace change, refusing to allow outside blood to enter. As the last of his bloodline, the boy was a living testament to what had happened when a family isolated itself for too long. His deformities were the product of generations of silence, of choices made long before his birth. The family's legacy was written in the scars of its members. The deformities, the sickness, the mental deterioration, these were the physical manifestations of a curse that had been passed down through the generations. And it was now complete. The boy's death marked the end of an era. His family, once proud and self-sufficient, was now a relic of the past. The silence that had bound them together had finally consumed them, and there was no one left to carry on the name. The family had always believed that their bloodline was sacred, that purity was essential to their survival, but in the end, it was that very purity that had caused their destruction. The family's refusal to let in new blood had sealed their fate. In the end, the boy's story was not just about the tragedy of one man's life. It was about the cost of silence, of isolation, and of refusing to face the truth. His life had been stolen by the very family that was supposed to protect him. The boy, in his final moments, had no one to turn to. He was the last of his bloodline, a man whose existence had been defined by the choices of those who came before him. And now, there was no one left to carry on. The mountains, once a place of refuge, had become a tomb. The boy's family had lived and died within the same boundaries, never venturing beyond the isolated world they had created for themselves. Their legacy was one of destruction. The boy's life, like those before him, was consumed by the silence of his family's choices. He had never known freedom, never known a life outside the suffocating grip of isolation. And now, there was no one left to break the cycle. In the end, the family's curse was not just in their deformities, but in their inability to change. They had closed themselves off from the world, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. The boy was the last to fall. The silence that had defined the boy's life had finally become his tomb. The family, now gone, had left behind a legacy of destruction, a warning about what happens when isolation and secrecy take root in a family's heart. The boy had never known love, never known a life outside of the mountains. His family's history had defined him, and now it had destroyed him. His life had been a tragedy, a reflection of the price of silence. The family's legacy was one of pain, of suffering, and of isolation. It had been passed down from generation to generation, and it had claimed the boy as its final victim. The mountains were now empty, and the silence was all that remained. In the end, the family's downfall was inevitable. It had been written in the bloodline, passed down through generations of men who had chosen silence over truth. And as the boy's death marked the end, nothing was left but the echo of their mistakes. The legacy of this family, of silence and inbreeding, had finally come to an end. The boy's death was the final chapter, the last of a bloodline that had been destroyed by its own choices. The silence was now complete.